Something that I had been assuming that everybody knew, but it came to my attention that everybody does not know. Matthew chapter 24 is probably one of the most disputed chapters in the whole Bible. Matthew chapter 24 has a lot of apocalyptic, cryptic, ambiguous type language. And if you're not familiar with apocalyptic language, people have come up with all kinds of interpretations of Matthew chapter 24, and you may be familiar with some of these. The idea of being raptured away from the earth, the idea that in the future there is a huge tribulation coming across the whole earth, the idea that in the future a Messiah will sit on a throne in Jerusalem in the future. All of that comes from Matthew chapter 24. And I should say from our understanding of Scripture, those are erroneous views of chapter 24. And so one of the reasons we've walked through, this will be our fifth sermon now in Matthew chapter 24. And one of the reasons we've taken so much time is I want to point out to you the concrete, unambiguous clues that are embedded in the text that help us recognize the nature of the bounds of the interpretation of Matthew 24. There are internal clues, internal embedded, I guess you could call them markers that do let us recognize the nature of these prophecies. And those are the things that I'm trying to share with you, and we'll finish up today. We're going to look at the signs of Jesus coming, Matthew chapter 24, verses 15 through 35. And I want to be careful with that title. Hopefully we remember from previous sermons that the idea of Jesus coming needs to be divided into two categories. There is a coming of the Lord, whether it's God or the Holy Spirit or Jesus. There is a coming that happens all the time, throughout time, and it is a coming to wage war against enemies of the gospel. It's a coming to wage war against the enemies of God. It's a coming that is a judgment of destruction for covenant breakers. That happens all throughout the Old Testament, and it's still happening today. Nations rise and fall all the time. When nations fall, that is a coming of the Lord, coming in judgment, coming to wage war against covenant breakers, coming in judgment against sin. But that's not what we call the second coming of Christ, the end time coming of Christ. That is usually denoted as the second coming, and the Scripture has taught us the second coming has nothing to do with sin. He said that second coming is not going to have anything to do with sin. It's going to have to do with Christ coming to take away all of the believers that have been waiting for Him. That's the second coming, the last coming. But in the meantime, there is another concept of a coming in judgment against lawbreakers, against covenant breakers, against where God comes to deal with the sinfulness of men and nations. Well, today, Matthew chapter 24 is not going to be speaking to us about the second coming of Christ at the end of time. Matthew 24 describes a coming of Christ that was prefaced by the temple will be destroyed. Matthew 24 and verse 3. Do you see all these buildings? Not one stone is going to be left on top of another stone. What is he saying? That I am going to come in judgment on Jerusalem for being covenant breakers. Not only did they kill the prophets, but they're about to kill the Son. And if you remember the parable that he gave, he asked the scribes and Pharisees, what will God do to those horrible people that killed both the prophets and the Son. And it said, he'll come and he'll burn their city. That is exactly what Matthew 24 is talking about, the destruction of Jerusalem. This will be our 5th sermon on Matthew 24, and I really think it's important to watch all 5 of these in order to really grasp the little concrete, objective, unambiguous, embedded markers in the text that do reveal to us that this is about the destruction of Jerusalem. All of these embedded markers form kind of a boundary. They form the limitations of how we interpret the text. All right, so one sermon topic. One sermon topic for you today. It's at the top of your handout. Identify one concrete, objective clue or embedded marker in each text that we look at today that constrains our interpretation of Matthew chapter 24. That's what I'm going to give you. Today we're going to look at the second section of Matthew 24, which is verses 15 through 35. And the first thing I would like to point out to you that is a marker, an embedded clue to help us recognize a good interpretation of this section, Matthew 15 through 35, is that this section is a recapitulation of the first section. We've already mentioned the word recapitulation, but a recapitulation, you may be more familiar with the term a recap. We're going to recap what we did. That's short for recapitulation. I'm going to restate everything I've already restated is what Matthew is saying to us. And I gave you the little chart on your handout there. Today's section, the Son of Man section, verses 15 through 35, is a recap of what we call the end of the age section, which was 2 weeks ago, verses 4 through 14. And a recap means I'm going to say the same thing, but I'm going to use different language, different imagery in order to see this from 2 different perspectives. The most popular example of a recapitulation in the Bible is the Gospels. 4 Gospels that are 4 perspectives on the same story. And that's what we are looking at today. So I want you to notice the false Christ that we're going to read about in verses 23 through 28 matches the false Christ that were talked about in verses 4 through 5. The tribulation we're about to read about today, verses 15 through 22, matches the tribulation we already read about in verses 6 through 13. The gathering of the elect. These verses, when we really get into apocalyptic imagery and people get confused by it. Well, one clue that we have is he is telling in verses 29 through 34 what he already said in verse 14 when he said he will send out the messengers to preach the gospel to the whole world. That is the gathering in of God's elect. And finally, we're going to see in verse 35, he draws a conclusion, and then will come the end. Dun, dun, dun. Then comes the end. What does that mean? Well, from previous sermons, we've already concluded that the end is the end of that age, the end of the Jerusalem temple, the destruction of that old Mosaic covenant. And here is why, from previous sermons, here is why the temple and Jerusalem must be destroyed. He said, because Jesus is the true high priest that enters the actual Holy of Holies in heaven. And because the true high priest has come and he has entered the true Holy of Holies in heaven, the book of Hebrews taught us in previous sermons, Hebrews said it is necessary that the copy and the shadow be taken out of the way. Jerusalem and the temple was a copy and a shadow of the heavenly realities. And now that Jesus brought the heavenly realities, the copy and the shadow must be destroyed. That copy and shadow of that temple holy of holies must be destroyed, because we're not interested with the temple's holy of holy anymore, because Jesus entered the true holy of holies. So, our clue number one, this is a restating or a recapitulation of what's already been said. Now we come to what I'm going to call section 1. I believe I've broken our text, verses 15 through 35, into 4 sections. There they are: the tribulation, the gathering, the end, and the false Christs. And each one of those sections, rather than getting into some of the far-out, cryptic, apocalyptic language and explaining that, I'm going to take a simpler route. And I'm going to show you the embedded markers, the embedded clues in each of those sections that tell us that this is about the destruction of Jerusalem. And that's the point of the sermon today. So, section 1, the tribulation, verses 15 through 22. And notice that he is recapping what he already said about the tribulation in verses 6 through 13. We'll pick up in verse 15. So, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Verse 16, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Verse 17, let the one who is on his housetop not go down. Verse 19, alas for women who are pregnant, it's going to be difficult for them. Verse 20, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, because there will be great tribulation. Now, we've already spoken many times of a very important word called schemas. A schema is all the information that comes to your mind when you hear a certain word or a certain phrase. Phrases like, they'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. As soon as you hear that phrase, you get an idea of what you think that means. You may have seen the text that we're looking at right now, the abomination of desolation. You might have a schema about what that means. And today I want to show you some of the clues in this text that limit or restrict what that means. And you might have to compare what you thought this text was saying in light of some of the new information that I want to point out to you today. Typically, people read this section and go, that's the end of time, that's the end of the world, the second coming of Christ. And I want to suggest to you that no, this is about the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Let me tell you why. The first clue in here is that this is going to be, and typically the Great Tribulation. Thank you, Ron. Wow, you guys know me so well. Thanks, Ron. Let's look at some of the intratextual markers that we have. Most people think that this Great Tribulation, you've heard of this as something that's going to come over the whole world and it's going to be terrible, and you better hope that you're raptured before this happens. Well, I want you to recognize that the text itself tells us that the tribulation that is coming is limited to Judea. Can you look at your text and see that? Notice verse 16. When you see this sign, the abomination of desolation, we'll get to that. When you see this sign, you guys better get out of Judea. You better run for the hills where you will be safe. Do you see it? It's not some kind of worldwide tribulation. No, this is a localized tribulation in Judea. And when you see something happening in the temple, that will be your sign to get out of Judea and run to the outskirts of the town, because that's where you will be safe. That's marker number 1. I want to go ahead and give you some history, because we've got some Roman historians and we've got Josephus that record for us that historically the Christians in Judea, the Christians in Jerusalem, saw the sign in the temple and they knew that it was time to escape. Let me read some of these to you. It looks like the escape of the Christians happened in early 66 AD. What was happening in 66 AD, by this time there was massive bloodshed on the Temple Mount. By 66 AD, it happened way earlier. But this was not the Romans coming to persecute Jews. This was the Jews having civil wars amongst themselves. The real reason Rome came to destroy Jerusalem was not because they hated the Jews. It was because there was massive civil and political unrest in Jerusalem. The Sicarii, the Essenes, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, the Idumeans, all kinds of people were showing up in Jerusalem, and there was massive unrest in Jerusalem. Josephus says that there was so much unrest in Jerusalem that you could not walk through the city without stepping on a dead body. And this is before Rome ever comes. The reason Rome comes is because Jews were crying out for someone to help. And that's when Rome shows up. Nonetheless, the bloodshed was already happening. In late 66 AD, November of 66 AD, Nero is the emperor, and he sends a guy named Cestius Gallus he was the governor of Syria. He was the closest guy, and he sends him down to find out what is going on in Jerusalem, and I want you to put a stop to it. Cestius Gallus. The history tells us that Gallus took with him 30,000 soldiers. That is 6 Roman legions, 5,000 soldiers in every Roman legion. He took with him 30,000 soldiers. He thought he would walk into Jerusalem and take over. After 9 days, the Sicarii and the Zealots in Jerusalem defeated Cestius Gallus, and he ran away with his tail tucked between his leg. The first Roman invasion was unsuccessful. Can you imagine? 30,000 troops were unable to penetrate Jerusalem. That is what got Rome angry. And from 66 to 70 AD, waves of Romans start coming into Jerusalem. And by November of 66 AD, the Christians better be out of Jerusalem or you're going to be slaughtered. Just so you understand something, after Nero died during this time, Nero dies in 68 AD. Vespasian will be the next emperor. Vespasian takes over, and the historians tell us that Vespasian surrounded the city and waited so that anybody that wanted out was free to leave. It's important to know that the Romans gave the citizens an opportunity to leave Jerusalem or be destroyed. Let me read some of these to you. This one is going to describe the invasion of Cestius Gallus in late 66 AD, November of 66 AD, and he says by that time the Christians had already left the city. Here's our quote. In October, the Jews managed to band together to fight the Roman forces and successfully expelled Gallus, that's the Roman governor of Syria, who withdrew his forces in November of 66 AD. At this point, all of Judea was united in the revolt, with the exception of the Christians who had fled the country during the 5 months between May and October. Vespasian rewarded the Christians for not taking part in the revolt against Rome by allowing them to practice their faith without persecution. So we know that sometime prior to May of 66 AD, the Christians saw whatever abomination of desolation happening in the Temple Mount. They saw it, and they knew, here's another one of your intratextual clues. The Christians knew that Jesus' prediction was for them. This is information that we Christians need to pay attention to, and we need to escape Judea. There's another indication. They knew it was for them, not for some far-off, scary thing. Let me give you a couple more quotes. There's another quote by Epiphanius, and he records the same thing, but he tells us where the Christians went. Very fascinating here. From there it took its beginning after the exodus from Jerusalem, when all the disciples went to live in Pella, because Christ had told them, leave Jerusalem and go away, since it would undergo a siege. And because of this advice, they lived in Perea, after having moved to that place, as I said before. Now, Epiphanius said that in that book, but there was another book that Epiphanius records things, and he reproduces another quote about the Christians knowing that they needed to get out of Jerusalem. Here it is. They were such as the ones that came back from the city of Pella to Jerusalem and were living there and teaching. For when the city was about to be taken and destroyed by the Romans, it was revealed in advance to all the disciples by an angel of God that they should remove from the city, as it was going to be completely destroyed. They sojourned as immigrants in Pella, the city that was above mentioned in the Transjordan. And this city is said to be of the Decapolis. The Decapolis, today it's called the Golan Heights, on the other side of the Jordan. Another intratextual clue, another embedded marker in the text, is the verse that says, pray that your flight might not be on the Sabbath. How is that a marker for us? Are we under the Sabbath obligation today? We're not under a Sabbath obligation because we're no longer under the Mosaic covenant. That is why Jerusalem and the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, was to make it clear that the Mosaic covenant had been taken out of the way. The old covenant was taken out of the way, and Jesus came to institute a new covenant. So as a result of Jesus' new covenant, there is no longer a Sabbath observation. And yet the text is clearly saying, you better not hope. You better hope that this invasion doesn't not happen in proper English. You better hope that the invasion doesn't happen on a Sabbath. That is a time indicator. That is a limitation as to when this Great Tribulation was going to happen, while people were still under the Mosaic law, the Sabbath. Now we come to this interesting text and where most people put their focus. I think we should focus on those intratextual markers that I just gave you because they limit our interpretation of the text. But most people want to focus on the ambiguous, harder thing, the abomination that causes desolation. Lots of interpretations of what that was. We've already revealed, even we may not know exactly what it looked like or what it was. We know that the Christians saw it and they left Jerusalem in May of 66 AD. So whatever it was, it already happened. Well, let me give you a list of some of the events that happened prior to 66 AD. The first one is this influx of Roman soldiers, 30,000 soldiers. You could have seen them coming from a distance. They came and they tried to take over Jerusalem. They were unsuccessful. But you may remember that in Luke's account of this event, Luke says, when you see armies surrounding Jerusalem, that is your clue to get out. Luke is the one that gives us that information. So it is very likely that by the time these 30,000 soldiers were coming to invade Jerusalem, that was the clue to get out. It could also be that in the temple, because different people, and there was massive bloodshed in the temple, different people that took over the temple instituted different laws. One of the laws that was instituted that stopped in 66 AD was they offered daily sacrifices to the Roman emperor. In the temple in Jerusalem, they were offering daily sacrifices to the Roman emperor. That would have been an abomination that causes desolation. They stopped doing that in late 66 AD, is what the historians tell us about that. The other one is the invasion of the Sadducees and the Pharisees, the Sicarii, the Zealots, the Idumeans, the bloodshed, the sacrilege that was happening in the temple. Any of these things could have been the clue. Hey, it's time to get out of here. Section 2 is the false messiahs section, and this is going to be our third clue. We're going to find an intratextual marker here. Let's read it together, verses 23 through 28. Verse 23, then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, don't believe it, because false Christs and false prophets will arise. And you remember when we covered those previous verses 4 and 5, I gave you all the historical information on false messiahs and false Christs, so I won't go into that again. Verse 25, jump down to 25. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, here he is in the wilderness, do not go out. Jumping down to verse 27. As lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Verse 28, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Now this is a recap of what we already studied in verses 4 through 5. He gives a lot greater detail here, and here he uses apocalyptic language, hyperbolic language. And if you want to learn how to define apocalyptic language, go back and look at verses 4 and 5, and there's your definitions. But I want to point out something. Notice he says, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. You're going to have to challenge your schema at this point. What do you think that means? Most people think the coming of the Son of Man, the end of time, the second coming. But we've already established that this whole chapter is about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. So what I want to draw your attention here, the embedded marker that we have here is verse 28. Verse 28 is the concluding statement of the section. Verse 28 is a summary, is a trite phrase that is what the section was leading up to. That's called an aphorism. That's a good word for us to know because it is a biblical marker. First, let me say, what is an aphorism? An aphorism is a concise or memorable expression of a general truth or a principle. You may be more familiar with the aphorisms, hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's an aphorism. The acorn don't fall far from the tree. That's an aphorism. And the way the Bible uses aphorisms is the Bible will introduce a text, a saying, multiple verses, and will conclude that section with an aphorism that explains it all. So let me take the first one here. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Someone might start telling the story of how their son, a young man, black hair and blue eyes, that decided to try to change the timing chain in his car. His car was working fine, but he thought it would be a good idea to replace that timing chain anyway. And when he did replace the timing chain, car never ran again after that. And his father said, hey, Tony, young man, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Do you see how the aphorism at the end summarizes the context? Well, that is a biblical marker. That is something that the biblical authors use. For the sake of time, I could give you a lot of them in the Bible, but let's just do this one. The summary of this section of text is, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. What does that mean? Fundamentally, he's saying that the thing that is destined to die, the thing that is already dead, you're going to recognize it because you're going to see all the birds circling around it. What he means by that is Jerusalem, all through the book of Matthew. We remember all the way in the first pages of Matthew, John already said the axe is already at the root of the tree. From the opening pages of Matthew, the whole thing has been looking forward to the kingdom will be taken away from this corrupt generation and given to a people who will bear fruit. Throughout the text, it says the Pharisees knew that Jesus was talking about them. They felt the accusation falling on them. Throughout this Matthew, he says, all of the righteous blood that has been shed from Abel all the way to, Zechariah, is going to fall on this wicked generation. The thing that was destined to die was Jerusalem and the temple. And he says in this aphorism, and you're going to recognize it when you see the vultures start circling around. Vultures is another name that was used in that day for eagles. Now, I'll give you two opinions on this. One, we already said that Luke told them, when you see the armies surrounding Jerusalem, you know the end is near. The armies surrounding Jerusalem are the vultures or the eagles, and the corpse, the carcass, will be Jerusalem and the temple. That's the nature of that aphorism. Something is about to die, something is about to be destroyed, and you'll recognize it soon enough when you see the vultures come around. That's probably the best interpretation of that aphorism. There is one, you could go one further, and I'll just leave this up to you. The first invasion of Jerusalem was 30,000 soldiers, 6 Roman legions, and it was unsuccessful. Then Vespasian comes in, and I should have got this number for you. I don't know how many legions Vespasian brings in, but here is something of interest. Every legion, every 5,000 detachment of soldiers has a Roman eagle, a tall stand with a golden eagle at the top of that stand. And what the commander would do with that eagle is what was telling the legion what they needed to do in the battlefield. So every 5,000 soldiers had one guy with a massive eagle on the top of a pole. It could be that this idea of wherever the eagles gather, how many dozens of Roman legions came with these Roman eagles all standing up around Jerusalem? That's the nature of that aphorism. Let me give you the verse in Luke 21. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Look at the image that Luke paints for us. Luke 21 and verse 20. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, these are the eagles or the vultures, then you know that the desolation, the carcass, is about to happen. The desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out. Let those in the country stay out of the city. Where is the carcass going to be? Where is the desolation going to happen? In the city. All right, the third section is the gathering of the elect. Again, we're going to see apocalyptic imagery of angels going out to the ends of the world and gathering the elect. This is a parallel to what we already looked at in the chart that I gave you there to begin with. The gathering of all the elect by God's angels mimics what was already said in verse 14. The gospel will go out to all the nations. This is what apocalyptic language looks like. Verse 29. And immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. They'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with great glory. Verse 31. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather the elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Let's pause right there. What kind of schemas did your brain imagine as we read that text? Probably most of us thought that's the end of the world, the destruction of all the elements, the sun, the moon, the stars. All of that is the end of the world. Well, your embedded clue here, your embedded marker here is verse 34. Let's read it. Verse 34, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all of these things take place. That is your concrete, objective, unambiguous marker. You guys are going to see all of this happen. So because of that marker, some of us may have to challenge, oh, that's not what I thought that text was saying. Fair enough, but there is your embedded marker. You guys are going to see all this happen. What is all of that language talking about? Well, it's apocalyptic stockpile imagery of the destruction of a nation. I would like to go in and define all of those things for you, but I don't have time. But those are the kinds of things that get said when God is about to come destroy a nation. And that fits with our context. In 40 years, God will come, I will come and destroy Jerusalem. All of this Son of Man coming on the clouds, angels going out with loud trumpet calls, is limited by verse 34. This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So it wasn't the second coming of Christ that he was announcing. It was a coming to do away with sin. It was a coming in judgment and wrath. And that is typically the way the Bible announces the destruction of a nation, because you guys have been covenant breakers. And you have broken my covenant long enough. It's time for me to pour out the cup of my wrath. We could see another coming of the Lord. Not the second coming, but God may just be sick and tired of the greatest nation in the world, founded and built on Christian and biblical principles, covenant principles, right? Adultery used to be against the law. Did you know that? Homosexuality used to be against the law because we were founded on covenant principles, and God blessed our nation as a result of that. Are we still following covenant principles, or are we breaking our covenant with God by the things that our government is exalting, by the ideology that's being advocated in our day? Are these things respecting the covenant between us and God? Righteous and blameless because we love God, we know what He wants, and we don't like the things that God doesn't like, but it looks like our government loves everything that God hates. We may see a coming, a destruction, a wrath against covenant breakers. We may witness that in our own time. By the time we get to this section of text in Matthew 24, I want to remind you, verse 34 says, "This generation will not pass away." All this is going to happen. That shouldn't be new to us. The unfortunate thing with us as mere mortals is by the time we get to Matthew chapter 24, we've already forgotten what we learned in Matthew chapter 6, Matthew chapter 10, Matthew chapter 14. We've already forgotten all that. So let me go back and remind you that Jesus had already said that this coming in judgment and wrath was going to happen during their life. Let me remind you, Matthew chapter 10 and verse 23. Verse 23, "When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next one. For truly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes." I'm sending you guys out to take the gospel to the ends of Judea. But you won't get done with that before the judgment and wrath comes on Jerusalem. That is the language of the Son of Man coming. It's a vindication that Jesus has been exalted to the right hand of God, that He has, the one like a Son of Man, has gone on the clouds to the Ancient of Days. He has been given all power and authority over everything in heaven, on earth, and under the earth. And just in case first century people think, no, we killed that guy, the destruction of Jerusalem is His vindication that I am who I told you I was. I let you kill me, but that was only to facilitate my transportation on the clouds up to the Ancient of Days. And now that I'm there, I'm no longer a lamb that was slain. I'm the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And I am coming to get my vengeance on those people that hated the prophets and hated the Son of God, the destruction of Jerusalem was his vindication. Last one, section 4. This is going to correspond to verse 14 in the last section. The second part of verse 14 said, and then the end will come. It was very clear. Here, it's a little bit more ambiguous. Let me read you the text, verse 35. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. That might be another aphorism, another statement that summarizes the whole section. What is he saying here? Again, I should have spent the majority of time on verse 35, guys, because in all honesty, our schema, the images we get in our mind when we see the phrase, heaven and earth will pass away, I'm going to challenge what you think that means today. Because what we think it means, since we're unfamiliar with a lot of the Old Testament, we're unfamiliar with the Jewish idea of heaven and earth. What was that ancient idea of a concept of heaven and earth? I'm going to share that with you. But if you are unfamiliar with the Jewish concept of a heaven and a earth, then we're going to invent our own idea. Oh, this is the destruction of the world at the end of time. And I want to give you some embedded information that's going to require us to recognize that heaven and earth was the Jewish idea of the temple and Jerusalem. So I want to give you some texts, if that sounds strange and foreign to you. He is predicting heaven and earth will pass away, meaning Jerusalem and the temple will be destroyed. And I want to give you the texts that you might need to help change your imagination of heaven and earth being destroyed, a new heaven and a new earth. What does all that mean? Here's your texts. The first one shouldn't be too difficult for us. We're going to see it in Hebrews chapter 8, but all we have to do is go back and remember when God instructed Moses to build the tabernacle. Do we remember that God told Moses, make sure that you build this exactly the way I'm showing you? Why was it important that Moses build the tabernacle exactly like God showed him? Because it's a copy of heaven. Let me give you that verse. Hebrews chapter 8 explains the nature of the temple. Hebrews 8, they serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and a shadow of what is in heaven. That is why Moses warned when he was about to build the tabernacle, see to it that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown to you. That earthly tabernacle, that earthly temple is a copy of heaven. There's your first clue. There's your first Jewish understanding. If we go on to try to understand the Jewish mindset of their perception of that sacred temple on earth, what was it that made it so sacred? Well, part was there was the Holy of Holies that was a copy of heaven where the presence of God lives. What about the outside of the Holy of Holies where all the priests were working every day? What did that symbolize? The outside of the Holy of Holies where the priests work every day is the earth. Why? Because that's where people are allowed to go. People are allowed to be on the earth. What was the courtyard around the Holy of Holies and the earth? The courtyard around was the ocean that encircles all of the land. Probably not stuff we were familiar with. So there's the ocean, there's the earth, and there's heaven. And all of that was a copy or a shadow of the realities. Let me take you to the psalmist, Psalm 78 and verse 69. Look at how he refers to the temple. 78 and verse 69. And he built his sanctuary like the heavens and like the earth, which has been founded forever. A part of the reason that the sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, is called heaven, earth, and the ocean is because there was a notion that the heavens and the earth last forever. In like manner, the temple and the Holy of Holies would last forever. That's what the Jewish people thought. Not recognizing that the earthly temple and the Holy of Holies was only a copy and a shadow of the real thing. And when the real thing shows up, the copies and the shadows must be destroyed. And the language for destroying the temple and Jerusalem that the Bible uses is, I will destroy the heavens and the earth, and I will usher in a new heavens and a new earth. I know that's got to be challenging for many of us because we have a 21st century understanding of those words. But as responsible Bible readers, we must go back and say, what was the ancient biblical understanding of the phrase, the heavens and the earth? And it was the temple and the Temple Mount. Let me show you how Isaiah uses the same language that Jesus uses about destroying the present heavens and the earth so that I can build a new one. Isaiah used the exact same language as Jesus. Look at Isaiah chapter 65 and verse 17. Isaiah 65:17, Isaiah is foreseeing the destruction of Jerusalem when the Babylonian armies come in and destroy Jerusalem. Look at the language. Verse 17, for behold, I create a new heavens and a new earth, and the former things shall not be remembered or come to mind. But be glad and rejoice forever in that which I create. Listen to what he's going to create. For behold, I will create Jerusalem to be a joy, and her people to be a gladness. I'll destroy heaven and earth, and I'll recreate it. What was he talking about? Jerusalem. I'm sure that's got to be strange to most of us. But we've got to use biblical understandings to interpret biblical words. Let me show you, Josephus also records for us how the temple was built. And Josephus, I would look at this in Antiquities, book number 3. I would read the whole chapter, guys. I'm only going to give you a few verses. But Josephus, who was alive at the time of Jesus, so whatever Josephus understood about the temple is what everybody understood about the temple. Josephus describes the curtain symbolized something. The walls of the temple symbolized the waves of the ocean. He goes into all kinds of detail, but let me just give you a little piece of it. Josephus, Antiquities, book number 3. For if anyone would look upon these things, he will find that they were every one made in a way of imitation and representation of the universe. When Moses distinguished the tabernacle into 3 parts, he allowed 2 of them to be used by the priests as a place that was accessible and common. And he denoted the land and the sea because these are of general access to all. But he set apart the 3rd division for God because heaven is inaccessible. So the temple was a portion that's inaccessible, which is an imitation of heaven, And then there's 2 courts where everybody gets to go hang out, which represent the earth and the ocean, because everybody can hang out in those places. So then, we leave off that section with the destruction of the temple. Heaven and earth will disappear, but once the temple is destroyed, once Jerusalem is taken out of the way, what's going to be left? My words. These things will be taken out of the way, but my words are going to remain. My words will still exist long after Jerusalem has been destroyed. I want to take you to a verse where we see that specifically being said, Matthew chapter 28 and verse 19. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations and baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and teach them to observe everything that Moses commanded? No, everything that I have commanded you. Because I'm taking Moses and the temple out of the way. Now the only thing that matters are the things that I have told you. There's a new kid in town, somebody might say. Heaven and earth will disappear in 70 AD. But my words will never disappear. I want to take you back to one other text that we already wrestled with in Matthew chapter 5, and then the sermon is yours. Matthew chapter 5, Jesus had already said something very similar to this. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 18. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth passes away, not a single jot, not a stroke of the pen will disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. No part of the Mosaic law will disappear until heaven and earth disappears and until I've accomplished everything. That text right there, did I give it to you? Yeah. Again, our schema is probably being challenged. But ask yourself, are we still under the law of Moses today? No, we are not. It has disappeared because heaven and earth, Jerusalem and the temple, have been destroyed. So now the Mosaic law can disappear because, in the last words, I have accomplished everything. When Jesus was on the cross, He said, it is finished. So even this verse that we're so familiar with is describing the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, not some end time event. Period. Is that enough?